First saw that actor.
Not really a joke. Okay. No, of course not. Yeah.
They put them on. When I got chicken for dinner. Go catch chicken.
Originally.
Around the yard.
And then after that, that's a long conversation.
No go party.
Yeah, like, I just need like casual, like, option.
There's this girl that's on like a vegan.
Yeah.
No, she lives
That's why you got, yeah.
and she feeds her family.
Yeah.
She's a vegan. Is she a plant? Not.
Never seen them as a vegan.
Yeah, wow.
I have
That's a VHS tape.
No, and then two different places.
Turns into an electric.
Yeah, there's so many. My phone filled it.
Really?
I have.
They made me a copy.
But. Blood everywhere and other. Yeah.
I know, but because I usually like always do the same, like.
I don't even get usually, like, I don't, I pretty much never go to any guy is gonna be.
Like, I'm actually Georgia stuff like that.
Yeah. I don't eat like just breast. I eat like.
Oh.
No, like,
Press it down.
Yeah, my mom. Yeah. She's like, I love the green zone. They're so cool. And the place next door, the shisha bar, you've been there too. They have like just like it's like. I can drink that time. This cold. I never had it.
It's the last day of.
Yeah.
But like, it's good if you're looking for like a pot of something.
Yeah.
Veggie dog, yeah. Awesome.
Taking the photo.
Take her house.
Okay,
That's
that's
why
fine.
she said, "Oh, please, don't be sweet."
I rather have the hour. So hot.
So it's like some. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Like.
No, literally, like, no tiger from any tiger.
Medicinal objects, it just means it's something else that goes with something. Specifically.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, How to Avoid Retraumatization of Survivors, Shame, and Stigma. We are so grateful to have you here today for what promises to be a powerful and deeply necessary conversation on trauma-informed advocacy, healing, and justice. This event marks the final conversation in our assigned seminar series this semester with Nadia, and we truly cannot imagine a more impactful way to close. At the heart of today's discussion is someone whose voice and vision have transformed global awareness and action, Nadia Murad. Nadia is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and a courageous advocate for survivors of sexual violence and genocide. As a Yazidi survivor of the ISIS genocide, Nadia has taken unimaginable personal trauma and transformed it into a mission to protect others from the same. Through her work with Nadia's initiative, she's helping to rebuild communities, seek accountability, and ensure survivors are seen, heard, and supported. Joining us for this important dialogue is Simone Monosabian, the Chief Program Officer for Sanctuary for Families. Simone brings decades of experience in international justice and survivor advocacy, having worked at the intersection of law, human rights, and service provision to protect victims of gender-based violence. Her insights into policy and program innovation offer critical strategies for creating spaces of safety and dignity for survivors. Moderating this conversation is Amy Dacey, Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics. Amy has long championed inclusive dialogue and civic engagement, and we're honored to have her guide today's discussion. Today's event is not only about learning how to tell stories, it's about learning how to listen in ways that protect, uplift, and empower. It's about shifting the culture of advocacy so that survivors are no longer burdened by re-traumatization or silence, but instead are met with care, respect, and real change. With that, please join me in welcoming Nadia Murad, Simone Monosabian, and Amy Dacey.
Thank you so much. Did she do a great job or what? We're so proud of our student associates. Nadia, it's a little bittersweet today for me because this is your final seminar, but what you don't know is you never quit Sign. So we're going to have you back and working with us in many different ways. Simone, we are honored to have you here with us and thank you for taking the time. Just to do a little recap, you know, this is called a seminar series, but I honestly think that Nadia, you've taken us on a journey, you know, over the course of this semester. We started out learning about you, learning about the conflicts, you know, overseas, learning about what happened in Iraq, what happened to your family. You were just so honest and open and shared all of that with us. So I think that first seminar, if you remember, a lot of people were there that were in the room. It really was helping us to give context and what it meant and, you know, everything. And then, you know, we moved on to our second conversation that talked about who's doing the work, who are the organizations, who are the individuals and the groups that are, you know, kind of doing this work. So we got a little bit of an understanding. And then in this incredible way, you invited members from your initiative, Nadia's initiative, to come and talk about, you know, how might some of our students want to get involved in this work, and what is leadership, and what is, how are you successful in doing this work, and what is the definition? And here we are today, and we find ourselves talking about the people that are that go through these you know, dark tragedies that but are seen as definitely survivors, and what is their journey and how do they do this, you know, every day, whether they're talking about, you know, what's happened to them and sharing it as you do, or whether they're trying to find out how to move forward. And so I think the incredible thing is talking about this avoiding re-traumatization of the survivors and sharing the, and the shame and the stigma. So I appreciate you being able to have that conversation with us and help us understand how to also be good advocates for those individuals as well. So thank you so much for being here. Nadia, you've been such an outspoken advocate. Let's start a little bit with you. For these survivors, of trafficking and violence, being one yourself, can you share a little bit about the personal journey and like how you see yourself, when we talk about survivors and moving forward, like we talked about, if you just take some time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me again. And yeah, it's sad that this is the last one, but IU is home. We were just talking about this, and I have a big community here, whether the sociology department or here at
I
San
think
Institute.
some are here tonight. Is
Yeah.
some of the sociology people here?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're quiet, but they're mighty. Yes, yes.
But I also want to thank all of you for taking the time to come here and listen to us. I know this is a busy month for all of you. Some of you are graduating. Congratulations, you made it. And for others, you have exams and stuff to prepare. So thank you so much for the time. I think I just want to.
Sorry.
Okay, closer. Yeah. I grew up in Iraq with a lot of stories of honor killings. It was stories that were very close to me when I was very young, and then stories from other towns and cities. And it was really dangerous to be a woman growing up there. Someone could be killed for dating someone, publicly or going out with someone. And stories that I read, stories were familiar, but also so close to me that we will, we knew about these stories and sometimes about the victims, but it was so scary to even talk about these people in, like, even in the family. We just wanted to let it go. And then there were stories after stories. And of course, there were no laws to protect women. It happened because the laws were supporting the abusive partners. And sometimes it was the entire tribe or the village. And something that was so, it prepared me. I was always aware of the consequences of being a woman in Iraq. And I knew that a lot of women, for example, and when it especially comes to stigma, so many women in all communities in Iraq, not just from one religion or one community, those who were in, for example, abusive marriages couldn't even get a divorce because of the shame and stigma that will come with just being divorced. And a lot of women, decided to stay in that relationship. But there were also women like my mother who decided that it was not an abusive marriage, but that to my dad, she was not enough. And my dad got married over and over again. And she said, well, I think I'm capable
And
of.
that was a huge thing for her to do.
Right?
Correct.
Yeah. But, years later, my sister was divorced. And there was like this stigma. And, I remember my sister, after she was divorced for 2 years, she didn't attend any weddings, any events in the village because people would say, even though we knew that it was not uh, working for her, but yet you were expected to stay in that relationship. So the way that I grew up with stigma and shame that always blamed women, kept them in abusive relationship, kept them, stopped them from sharing their stories was something that I was aware, but I would have never dared to share it with the world. I couldn't even share it with my friends because the government was not supportive and you just were taught to let it go and not share it. But with ISIS and what happened to me and 6,500 women and girls, it was no longer a secret. It was not, a case of, individuals. it was so obvious and it was visible, but still a lot of them decided not to share their stories because we knew that everyone around us was aware that we were taken into captivity, that ISIS published videos and stuff on social media, opening markets, raping girls, buying and selling them, but it was still a lot of them were saying, I was just there to cook for them. That's it. But it was not the case because we had evidence. And one thing that I realized from that, it was, you may not be in real danger because it was coming from ISIS, but you could feel it all around you. And a lot of women, were saying to me and my friends that, in the future, you may not be, if you share it publicly, you may not be able to even get married because when you share a story of rape, it impacts your nieces, your cousins, your every female member of your family. For generations, it just comes back. And some other reasons, for example, a lot of women would say, but how if I want to, young girls, if I want to continue my education? And if I go to school, everyone knows that I'm raped, I can't do that. So there were so many consequences. If you shared your story, there was no way you could go back. You were out there exposed to the world. And a lot of the times you could not be believed. People would question everything about you, what you were wearing, where you were, even if you were taken from your own house. I mean, how can survivors of, for example, Boko Haram that, leave Yazidis out of Boko Haram who were taken, and a lot of them are actually never were reunited with their loved ones. And I met some of them. I was able to talk to some of them, and we experienced the exact same, um, form of shame and stigma. And a lot of them had children in captivity, and they were saying the same. I just want to be able to live in a camp that people don't know that I was raped. And even though there are so many stories and people have shared their stories, that there is a large percentage of rapes that are unreported because of stigma, which allows perpetrators and others to continue to do it because they know they have got impunity.
And because there's no ramifications in it, and it seems like when you start from that position, it's hard to find a path forward. I have to ask you because you are a former UNODC representative, and certainly I saw you nodding your head and just that I saw that look on your face, like like you've heard these stories before as well. An advocate for global justice. How have you seen the impact of this shame and stigma that Nadia mentions and in her personal journey and with her family, members she's seen, with others on survivors in different contexts, especially in conflict zones, because as Nadia brought up, her experience was in a certain geographic place, but it was not alone with her that these things are happening. This is a global issue. So can you share a little bit about your work and what you've seen?
Yeah, stigma, I was so interested to see that the topic today was stigma because having worked on sexual violence and armed conflict and working with survivors, amplifying and elevating their voices for 30 years now, one thing I learned is that more powerful than bullets or machetes or bombs is stigma as a weapon, right? To dehumanize and terrorize populations. And stigma has been around since the beginning of time because it's such an effective and efficient way to control people. And looking for those cracks in spaces to break stigma down is something that I've been working on for a long time. And you talk about what happens in armed conflict, it happens here as well. I'm now, having left the UN, working at an organization that's leading service provider for survivors of gender-based violence in New York. And we learned, it took us 37 years to learn, but now we're in our 40th year that on our board, we should not just have, partners from big law firms and financial executives and doctors, but we should have survivors on our board, right? And so I just started this new job a year ago, and I was speaking with the survivors and asking them about their experience on the board. And I learned a lot from them, that even in my organization, which is like the leading organization and is seen as being such a survivor-centered organization, the board members feel stigmatized who are survivors. And one of them told me something very interesting. She works, and she allows me to share this story, so I share it with her permission. She works for the mayor's office to end gender-based violence in New York. And she's an official there, in addition to being a board member in my organization. She tells me she regrets having openly identified as a survivor in her job, in her actual work, because everything that she says is viewed through the prism of, oh, this is a survivor who's affected by these things, whose judgment may not be, as nuanced as detached people who didn't have this experience, instead of understanding the value that she has, which is far more useful in terms of figuring out what survivors need, right? So if a woman who has power, who's on a board, who is a senior official in the mayor's office on gender-based violence, regrets in the context of her work identifying as a survivor, that tells you something, right? That we are not doing a good enough job.
It literally was somebody who had firsthand experience, who had more experience than anybody in the room to talk about these issues, felt like that was a barrier.
To this day, I mean, she regrets it, right? Because she's marginalized and put in a different bucket from everybody else, right? It's an us and them, right? And so it's a problem. When I first started working for the UN in the year 2000 as a war crimes prosecutor, the stigma was like much worse than it is today. So I'm hopeful that we're moving in some better directions, but the progress is at such an incremental pace. And so I'm going to come back to what I look at as hopeful. In the course of 20 minutes of time, actually it was like maybe 10 minutes of time, on December 16th of 2015, about 3:30 in the afternoon, I walked in a room thinking that business as usual is going to happen. And business as usual in the UN is, yes, we should care about survivors, but there's the good survivors and the bad survivors, and we don't want to give too much control to survivors, and we have to be careful who we invite to the table and how much power we share with survivors. And it was always fraught trying to have survivors respected and that their added value really leveraged. And then at the 7,585th meeting of the Security Council at the UN, somebody came to speak and make demands about how survivors should be considered and how stigma was not acceptable, and demanded that survivors be heard and that redress and platforms be given to survivors. And that was Nadia, right? And
Got chills thinking, I'm trying to see the stage, and you see her come out, and please give us a firsthand account.
Tons of papers and stuff, because normally I don't pay attention in those meetings, right? I'm like multitasking, like doing 100 things. And I was like, okay, the meeting is happening now. We organized the council meeting on human trafficking. It's the first one we ever organized. And, great, everything, the council is going to make a statement and put this higher on the agenda. Then when Nadia spoke, it was like no other meeting that happened before. And Samantha Power, who was the US ambassador to the UN at the time and later became the head of USAID, she said after Nadia spoke the following words: never before in the history of the Security Council, and Ambassador Power is a student of the Security Council, and I think Nadia and I are now students of the Security Council. Probably, yeah. Never before did anybody clap at the Security Council, even when they should have. Like, it's like a place where you don't clap, you don't smile, you don't give standing ovations. Nadia got like this huge standing ovation, and me, like this weathered New York war crimes prosecutor who only cried in public once in my life, and that was when General Dallaire made a speech, who, as you know, was very key in what happened in Rwanda. When Nadia spoke, like all my makeup was gone, all over my face. I was a shambles, and first you're trying to COVID, right? Because this is how my generation was trained. You don't cry in public. There's no crying in baseball. So that's for old people, that right? But
I saw some heads nod.
So, when Nadia spoke, at first I'm trying to hold it in, then I'm like, forget it. Just it's cathartic. And then I everybody is they're bawling. And so it clicked to me that all these hardened people from all over the world who were in the room that day, they listened to Nadia, not the other two speakers. Nadia was, I think, the third speaker, the last speaker who was speaking. It was Nick Rono, it was the Undersecretary General of UNODC, and you. And immediately I called up the UN officials and said, this is a moment that we cannot let pass, right? Now, it's not a survivor who's stigmatized. It's somebody who was listening to. Everybody's phone was down at the Security Council. I never saw that before. They're always doing this at Security Council meetings. You can watch them. They're on the website, right? And this was it. They didn't even know what to say afterwards. Their prepared remarks, like they just were speaking for a few minutes without their prepared remarks. Never happened before, right? And there was something about Nadia that clicked with people, that we have to do more for survivors. We have to listen to survivors, and that somehow the stigma problem wasn't evident in that moment. And so Nadia became stalked by me. And I asked her, would you become the UN's first goodwill ambassador for the survivors of victims of human trafficking? And in the past, I had appointed all kinds of survivors, Nicolas Cage, all kinds of people to be goodwill ambassadors. And they were always actors, actresses, or musicians, right? And the UN also would put a lot of sports figures, but never before was it a survivor leader, right? And so now Nadia and I Nadia's like, okay, I'll talk to you, fine. You're a girl. And we decided, without having any speaking engagement or any meeting, to go, this was like 6 months later, to Istanbul and stalk the Secretary General at the World Humanitarian Summit. And so we had no appointment with him. And normally I can get an appointment with him if it's on his official schedule, but this was the last minute thing. So Nadia had to stay in the hallway like all day long, waiting, and till we found somebody to get us snuck in, to have him understand about survivors and putting this higher on the agenda of the Security Council, and in the UN in terms of development, in terms of supporting survivors, and in terms of having survivors have a real voice in the UN. And so Nadia and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had a meeting. We were all kicked out of the meeting. Secretary General came late to the closing remarks of the World Humanitarian Summit, and he and Nadia were speaking. And now he is completely won over by Nadia, right? And he's part of the team Nadia. And then a couple months later, he appointed Nadia as the Goodwill Ambassador. Nadia then was voted unanimously by all 193 countries to become the keynote speaker at the Summit on Refugees and Migrants. And now Nadia's voice is on the level of other voices, and it's not that survivors don't have a place at the table. But did that make everything okay? No, it's a start. But
That seems like a huge moment. Like you pinpoint this date that this is where it kind of changed because, like you said, the impact that storytelling and survivor stories had, where the used to be the stigma. And so, when you put us so in the room, I'm afraid I have to ask. All right, Nadia, give us your version of that day, because I'm curious. Like, I love the way Simone set it up and talked about what that was. How did you feel in that room on that day? And did you feel like you actually had that much impact at that time, in that moment in time?
I remember I got to learn about the UN in the camps, and it was something that most people in the displacement camps were getting to know about the UN, because I didn't know anything about the United Nations before. And then when I was asked, I was already in Germany, to go and share my story at the UN. I remember I asked my brother who was in Iraq, and he said, I don't think you should go. You've already talked to the 60 Minutes, many people, you've tried your best. Now you're in Germany. And it was, he said, I think you should just focus on you and try to rebuild your lives. And it's just another meeting and you will share your story. And yeah, look at, many, like about 40 members of my family were still in captivity. My home was still under ISIS control. And I just said, let's just try this one too. And he said, it's up to you. But he was not happy because he just wanted to protect me and that I'm now in Germany. I should just, do what other girls were doing.
Right, so as your brother, as
Yes.
a family member,
Yes.
he was sharing that, and obviously he had seen the stigma that's attached sometimes with talking about
Yeah,
it
and
as well.
his wife was in captivity
Yeah.
when I was talking to him. So, I mean, he would do anything to get his wife back. But I just said, this is maybe it's America, and I would just go. I didn't know much about the UN, but I remember it was just the longest trip I took from Germany, Frankfurt to New York. And I was on my own and I was so scared and I cried a little bit. I tried to, and some people next
Must
to
have been
me.
intimidating.
It was
Even all
so-
that you'd been through, it must have been.
Yeah, it was my first time like being on a plane on my own because when I moved from Germany, from Iraq to Germany, I was with a group of Yazidi women and girls. So it was hard, but I knew the reason. I knew that I had to share my story. But honestly, I don't want to lie, I had no idea how much power was in that room. But before I walked into the room, Samantha told me, she said, these people in the room have so much power and they represent some of the most powerful countries in the world.
She said that to you right before you walked out.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a meeting right before, and I went in there and I shared. I didn't just want to talk about ISIS because I knew they already knew so much about ISIS, and I went so personal. And most of them were men, representing these countries, and it was in Arabic, but I tried my best, and I just in the middle of it, I just forgot that I was at the UN, and I felt that I was just in Mosul and I was looking at all these girls and children and my nieces, and I felt all of them were just like looking at me, and it never happened to me because it just was the first time talking to them. I didn't know what happened. I just knew a lot of them were just shocked. That's how they looked. They were shocked. And after that, the Iraqi, it's so important no matter like what they do, even if they don't protect you. After the speech, the Iraqi ambassador came to me and it just made like, I don't know, it was emotional knowing that someone from your government is finally listening to you. That was the first one in my own government, you know, listening to me, and he gave me an iPad. And I was like, okay, I didn't know how to even use it, but in all part of it, I also have just found this Iraqi politician who listened, and it was emotional coming all the way from Iraq and having the Iraqis like everyone else listening to me. It was sad, but I was also happy that I was not talking to one specific group of people, but there were also people from my own country representing my own country.
Imagine it. And Simone, I'm sure in that room, it's often so much data and reporting and information. And so to get this personalized storytelling, but as Nadia mentions the Iraq government being in the room, like I'm curious because, for both of you, the shame and stigma often serves, as you said, as barriers to healing for survivors. So how can governments and communities and what can they be doing, and NGOs to better address this? What needs to happen? Because it seems like we've come along, but your organization's still at work after we still have to do this work, right?
Well, first, I just want to say Nadia said that she didn't realize how much power there was in the room, and she's referring to the Security Council members. We didn't realize how much power was in the
Oh, I
room.
love that. I love that.
And so, what can we do about this? Let's talk about first what we shouldn't be doing, right? When I first started as a prosecutor in the year 2000 in the Rwandan tribunal working with survivors of sexual violence, this was the attitude of the UN. And we did a lot of good work, don't get me wrong, but we also need to face what we did that was wrong. For example, and read the Murad code, because every practice that we need to implement is in that code. It is so well written. It speaks to every experience that we had as prosecutors, every mistake. Nobody has to make those mistakes again if they follow the principles that are in the Murad code. So congratulations to you, Nadia, for coming up with something that is so meaningful. We used to send a white UN van into the community when we were interviewing survivors. Can you imagine? Everybody knew that that was the survivor being interviewed, and now they were stigmatized. But we do things to this day in New York courts that are just as bad. Go to a criminal trial and be called for jury duty. It might be a rape trial. It might be a sexual violence trial. And then what does the judge do in front of everybody in the jury pool? Because you're all sitting like this in the jury pool. Has anybody ever been a victim of rape or sexual violence? You don't do that in a courtroom like that. That's so backward thinking, and they're still doing that in jury rooms to this day. And that's why survivors need to do the training and the education. And we shouldn't represent the survivors, right? Because that word represent really irritates me. And I'm a lawyer, and I use it all the time. Because what are we doing? We are representing the survivor, right? The survivor should be leading, training, making the decisions instead of us interpreting what the survivor needs, what the survivor is saying, and making mistakes about what we should do with important funding. For example, what used to happen to survivors of sexual violence and armed conflict coming from the Yugoslavia atrocities was that counseling would be offered to the women who were raped. And the women who were raped said, you know what? I don't have time for that counseling. I need to get on with my life. Give the men counseling so that they don't look at us as scarred, damaged goods that they don't want to be involved with anymore. Teach them, right? So all this money and effort that we were putting into giving counseling to the women without asking them what they needed first and foremost was a lesson that we learned. Another thing, it's important to provide counseling, it's important to provide well-being, it's important to provide accountability, a platform, but it's also important to provide economic empowerment to survivors, right? And to pay them fairly for their work. So when you have survivors who are helping war crimes tribunals in terms of helping us prepare our cases in the UN in the year 2000, when I worked at the Rwandan tribunal, we were not allowed to hire Rwandans on our cases. Why? Because somehow, if it was a Rwandan prosecutor or a Rwandan interpreter, they were biased, and then the defense counsel could claim that they weren't really interpreting properly. Can you imagine this kind of thinking, right? And when we invite survivor leaders to speak on panels, we should compensate them. They're giving it expertise. If you're inviting a scientist to come and give their expertise, you compensate them. This lived experience is an expertise as well that we need to take seriously, right? Other practices that I would suggest is, I see an alarming trend these days that we should look at stigma as bad in any context. Yes, stigma is bad, but when people commit sexual violence, let us not go so far as some are suggesting, and this is my personal view, to say that the survivors should be encouraged to forgive the perpetrators, that forgiveness is the road towards a better life for everybody. For some people, it's not. And forgiveness is a personal choice, and it should not be imposed or expected or a political goal or funded, right? Unless a survivor wants to make that decision themselves. We shouldn't put survivors in buckets. Nadia and I were discussing this, the good survivor and the bad survivor. That's why some of the survivors Nadia was talking about said, I was only cooking in the kitchen, right? And we also have to tailor our responses in terms of survivors. A group of survivors that I work with, I then, after working in Rwanda, went to work in Sierra Leone. And a lot of the young women there were forced to be child soldiers. That was not their choice. And what a child does, right? Or even a young person who may not be a child, who's forced to do these things, we have to find ways to bring them back into the community when we can, right? And to stigmatize the behavior, but not the person who did that if they were forced to do that.
That's really
right?
powerful. So stigmatize the behavior and not the person. And that's what we've seen so often is it's the person that has to experience that. So
Right.
how do we change that?
I guess what I think you all are sociologists, students,
A
right?
lot are.
Many of you are?
Well, she's got, you said you were a fan club, like, she's got a fan club on campus with sociology,
So-
for sure.
I'm not a sociologist, nor do I play one on TV, but I was reading a lot about sociology to prepare, right?
You're sociology adjacent.
I like that. I like that. And do you folks know who Irving Goffman is?
They better say yes, the
Professors in here.
So I understand, I just learned this week, right? So no one perpetrated for me, like I know all this stuff, but it's supposedly one of like the foremost thinkers of sociology in the 20th century in America, right?
Yeah, on stage.
And so I like what Irving Goffman said, which is the stigmatized individual is asked to act so as to imply neither that his burden is heavy nor that bearing it has made him different from us, right? And it's such an interesting quote that, you know, from the 70s that the sociologist was saying and talking about stigma and the power of stigma. And what I can say is this, there are so many opportunities to break stigma down. That should be our action plan, right? Elevate and amplify the voices of survivors, not through us leveraging them, but through providing opportunities and assistance so that survivors can speak instead of us, right? And learning from survivors. Nadia is like one of my best teachers I ever had. What I worry about also in terms of, you know, where we're heading now is that it's easy to say, yes, we don't believe the survivor should be stigmatized. Yes, they should have a place at the table, but sharing power is very difficult for people to have had the power to tell survivor stories and decide what should be done. And so I think that a lot more needs to be done about that.
Well, it's such an important perspective to put. And let's go for a minute to the Murad Code, shall we? Like the overarching principles, understand survivors as individuals, respect survivor control and autonomy, be responsible and have an integrity, add value or don't do it. I think so much, and when you were creating and crafting this, words matter, right? I mean, language matters. So Nadia, for you first, but definitely for you too, Simone, like how important is the language used to describe survivors of violence and minimizing shame, you know, feelings of shame and guilt? And to me, it's like, what changes do you think are necessary in media and even in advocacy, so that not only people who want to help understand, but like how important is language?
I think language is so important. And I remember in my community, there was not a word for survivors. And for so long in the camps, people were saying those of ISIS hands. You know, it was like the way that,
Right.
yeah, the way they were like, they didn't even have a word for survivors. And they were saying those who came from ISIS hands and ISIS hands. And I remember meeting someone in Germany years after I moved to Germany, and she asked me if we were really completed, like a full person. And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "I don't know. I've heard that a lot of those of ISIS hands are not full human beings. Like they flash so much." And I knew like she didn't mean that, you know, physical parts of our bodies, which a lot of them did because of when the coalition was fighting ISIS. But it was the way that, you know, we were not able to talk the way we want. We lost so much part of us that we were trying to prove ourselves every single day in the camps while waiting for food or even after we moved to Germany. And language is what encourages survivors to share more or what they want to share, or it can also stop them, prevent them from sharing more. A lot of survivors were asked over and over again, about, what they were wearing, for example. And there are museums even like having, for example, survivors' dresses and stuff, just telling people that it's not about what you were wearing. These people were taken from their home. And even if not in conflict zones, in other parts, it's not about what you're wearing. But if you say like a bright color, then you might be blamed. And then that leads to also self-blaming and self-stigmatization, because sometimes you're just
They
getting
second
from,
guess,
Yeah,
sometimes you can
yes.
second guess yourself and
exactly.
how terrible that is, yeah.
But I think it's so important to take your time. Like if you don't know how to talk to someone with an experience like that, don't do it. Let somebody else do it. And I think it for survivors, a lot of them, I mean, I've never blamed my sisters from not sharing their stories. And their stories are so important. I know some parts of their stories, and it's even worse than my story. And I think their stories are worth to be shared with the world. But I don't blame them, because I know they are protecting themselves. I know some of them have, there were some uh, moments when they shared their stories and they were asked this question, how did you feel the next day? Is this really going to help the survivor or the international community to prevent this from happening? There's so much more. And actually, something that I always share about ICE is they were just so clear about what they wanted. These are women, young. We're taking them for rape because they are women. We will rape them. They had no other reasons to take them. Well, of course, your religion mattered, but it was also just the way they viewed women. And then you come out of that experience, whether it's ISIS or Boko Haram or domestic violence, and then you are being asked over and over again the same questions. You're not giving control over what you want to share and what you think it's important. And that just simply prevent survivors from sharing their stories. The language is important. And I think something that we shared when I was working on the Murad Code with MNF was, there was a long time ago a similar story in I think it was in Congo, where journalists were shouting out to people fleeing conflict and saying, who here speaks English and is being raped? I mean, who would say that it's me being raped? Language matters. I think it's important. And this is not, I'm not an expert, of course, on all the experiences and language of how you talk to survivors, but I have been able to meet a community of survivors from all around the world. And unfortunately, we all have these issues in common.
No, I think, certainly when you look at the first one that says treat as an individual, like the stories, there's a lot of similarities, but they're individual stories, and we can't lose sight of these are individual stories. Simone, how frustrated have you been with how people have used language, whether it was the media or government? And is it the role sometimes of the organization, of the individual, to help them, understand when they get it wrong?
I think that, at this point in time, it's been made very clear by survivors like Nadia and others what kind of language should be employed and what's important. We need to be in our choices about language. When Nadia came to the Security Council in 2015, one of her 5 demands was that we call what happened a genocide, right? And to call it what it was, right? And I think that that was important too, right? For survivors to heal, for people to call it what it actually was. It wasn't individual acts of violence only. Yes, it was that too, but it was greater than that, right? It was a genocide. And so I think that that was really important. And Nadia said that very early on, right? You said it to the Security Council and to the international community. And it took a long time for people to even listen and move away from the fear of using that, because when you use that word, international obligations have to come about, right? You've used the word, now you're obligated to undertake certain commitments that you signed on to under international law. And so that was the fear, right? They knew it was a genocide. There was no question that this was what it was. When Nadia talks about, oh, what were they wearing? The saddest thing I ever saw in prosecuting sexual violence and armed conflict was in one of our cases, a witness, I remember her name, they used pseudonyms in the Rwandan tribunal, TA, was asked by a defense counsel, you told me you were in the bush, the jungle for a week and they raped you repeatedly over the whole week. And it's very hot over there. You're telling me that you had no showers, there was no place to wash or clean, and that these men would rape you smelling as bad as you would have to smell after being there for 7 days. Actually said that. There's a transcript of this. Can you imagine? And that judges didn't put those lawyers in contempt or take away their credentials to appear in that court. I mean, everybody's entitled to defense. I was a criminal defense lawyer before I was a prosecutor. I am against mass incarceration. I think the criminal legal system in the US is highly flawed and never was a prosecutor here because of that. But that judges in an international court, which should have the highest standards and the best understanding of humanity, would allow a defense lawyer to talk like that to a survivor and all bloody hell wouldn't break loose. Well, you know what? The survivors, Rwandan women, it's always a group of survivor women who do the hard work, right? They got together and they stopped cooperation with the Rwandan tribunal. So the UN's work, no witnesses would come from Rwanda. And they said, this stops right now. And it changed all of that, right? And stigmatizing survivors with the imprimatur of the UN was not happening anymore. And you know what else came out of that? The survivors were getting antiretroviral treatment, right? Not just the accused who were in the UN jails, which had really good standards compared to, the jails in Rwanda, but the women were getting it now. So when survivors got in the door and were able to ask for what they need, the whole experience changed, right? But it shouldn't come to that. It shouldn't come to saying we give up about this process. We're going to make our own trials. We're not going to, cooperate with the international community. So I think listening is the most important thing, and always remembering that survivor leadership has to be both therapeutic and political, right? The therapeutic part is to facilitate healing and recovery, right? And the political part is to have redress for the systems and norms and practices that are the cause of interpersonal violence, right? Or gender-based violence in instances of sexual violence and armed conflict. So making sure that the therapeutic and the political are tackled at the same time is really important, that they operate in parallel.
I do want to save time for a couple questions, but there's something I have to ask, because I think, how does the global community help with this? How do we, as individuals, sometimes, you feel like this is something happening over there, but this is something that we should care about in every community, because as you said, there's no country that doesn't have this in some way, shape, or form, even the United States of America, And so what is the importance of the global community getting involved? You went and spoke to the UN, the work that you're doing, Simone, this is a global crisis in a sense. And so how do we, as individuals, wherever we are, help with this to break that stigma, to help survivors? What can we do as individuals?
You want to-
I think I just want to add to what Simone said, that, or just say, what you really said, listening is the first step to help. If you don't know, if you don't listen, there's no way you can help. And you may make the same mistakes as we were talking about it if you don't know much about it. So listening is important. The other thing is that, you talked about representation. I think we need to get rid of that. Survivors don't want to be represented. They want to be able to share their stories. I think one one of the main reasons that I pushed myself so hard to be able to learn the basic English, it was that I wanted to be able to communicate with people in my own words. There were people translating for me, but it was so important for me to represent what my story, my
Control over your
yeah,
story.
Yeah.
but not be represented by even translators, that I was not able to understand what they were saying about me. So it's really important to bring people to share their stories, to know that these individuals and group of women and girls who have been raped, who have shared their stories or not, they're like all of us. They have dreams and hopes, and they want to have a better life, to understand them. And, the international community there is a great awareness about this topic. It's not new. It's very old. They have seen it in all conflicts. They are very aware of it, and they have, if not heard from survivors directly, from their staffs and people, organizations that they support. And I think they continue, a lot of them, to see it as just a side effect of of conflict, but it's changing because survivors are taking the lead. I mean, I was in Ukraine, in Kosovo, in many places where it took place, and survivors are taking the lead, and we must change that. But in many places, it's still really bad. Like even in Iraq, for example, for the first time, the government, years after ISIS committed a genocide and sexual violence against Yazidis, they passed a law, it's called the Yazidi Survivors Law, to provide financial reparations to survivors. And when it was implemented and they started to call survivors, they were asking every one of us to bring 2 witnesses to the court to tell them that we were actually raped. And I said, then we called and we were able to reach out to the UN because a lot of countries supported the law. We supported. I visited the capital, talked to the government, and then survivors, friends, family members started to call and say, I don't want that.
It's literally the definition of re-traumatization.
Exactly. Why anyone would walk into a court, take 2 witnesses with you to tell the judge that you were actually raped? How do you think that support afterward is going to help that survivors to heal and move forward? It's not. So there's so much, even when there are positive changes, there's still so much within that change that you need to work on it and make it better for survivors.
But any final thoughts before we go to questions? Because I know they ask good questions too, by the way.
Excuse me very quickly, that also in not re-traumatizing the survivors, like I did something bad to Nadia, which she's never said, because Nadia is a very kind person who took pity on my stupidity. But during your appointment ceremony, I played a snippet of the video of you testifying at the Security Council. And I didn't tell you beforehand that I was going to do that. And I saw the pain that it caused you. And I thought naively, right? Me, who's been a prosecutor, who's very cerebral about these things, well, I'm not going to have Nadia tell her story again. This is not going to re-traumatize her by showing, a snippet. And I need people to understand this. But, that was not a good practice that I did at your appointment ceremony. And I've learned, to do better. We never talked about this, but just upon reflection now. And so everything should be trauma informed and discussed with the survivor. And even if there's a language barrier, make sure you have a good interpreter that the survivor has confidence in. And sometimes that won't be the official interpreter. That might be somebody who they trust, who may not have the best English skills, but will make sure that what Nadia is saying and is understanding is correct, right? What we do with survivors now, sometimes we have official translators. We won't use them. We'll use somebody who we trust because the survivor trusts that person. So just, having the trauma-informed approach is really important in everything we do. And letting the survivors speak about what they want to speak about is the most important thing.
I think it's also so important that nobody's a monolith, and we have to address these things. Like you mentioned before, your family has all had different journeys, and that you can't have expectations on each person to do the same thing. I will also say, I know everybody here, if they haven't already, has looked at the Murad code, and they should, because it's actually just incredible principles about how to be a good person and help other people. Right. And then to apply this to people, who have been through traumatic experience, but it's just good to think through. So I've learned a lot from the code just in my daily life. So I encourage it. Who has a question for Nadia and Simone? Katie's going to help us out. She always does. Thanks, Katie.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm a sophomore justice and law major here at AU with a concentration in terrorism and security studies. We see how important both of your work is, while also being very mentally difficult. So I'm just kind of curious how both of you find joy both in your work as well as outside of your work.
You know, she has a son and she named him just. I just,
Oh,
yeah.
love that.
So I know where you find joy.
Actually, I find joy here, and you were talking about this before we came in, that
Yeah.
being around students who are young and who see past them.
We're cool with it. Go ahead. Lean
Like,
in, Sabrina.
we had to pretend the bullshit wasn't there, or you guys, having it, right? And so that like gives us hope to be around young people. So I think that's it. And I find joy in seeing Nadia continue to teach. That gives me hope. And I don't know, what else do you find joy in, Nadia?
I, here, like you said, I love running, which thank you so much. Some of you might see me at the fitness here because I go and I've got a card, so I go to the gym. I really, really love running because I think when you run, which I remember because my first run was from captivity, it's just a reminder that no one can stop you from how far you want to go at yourself. You go and it's you're thinking and there are challenges and you want to stop, but no one really can stop you from how far you want to go. And people have tried to stop me, but I'm still going, and I will continue to go. And other things, I have really uh, a lot of friends, and I love watching. I good documentary. I am not a good cook, but I love watching my husband cooking for me, and then saying that's not good. So I just like. I also love watching on a new speech. Like every time I have a conference or somewhere that I'm asked to give a speech, I just love to work on a speech, and I always try my best because I think it's just so important. I know a lot is happening in the world, and we cannot keep up with everything. We cannot help with every person that is going through so much, but I think being able to come together in places like this, listening to one another, this is how we gonna help others, and we're gonna uh, continue to raise awareness. It's just it's important. Yeah.
I'm sure we have time for another question. Who has another question?
Hi, I'm Isabel Kim. I'm a sociology major. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how holding perpetrators accountable kind of plays into the destigmatization of victims.
Good question.
It is really important. One of the main uh, thing that we do at Nadia's initiative, but with, outside of Nadia's initiative, we work with some of the most amazing lawyers in the world. We work with prosecutors and most importantly, with survivors. A lot of the survivors who were able to, for example, move outside of Iraq, share their stories, because sometimes people forget that ISIS, and talking about ISIS, was an international group. Yes, there were so many people from Iraq and a lot of our neighbors, but there were people who came from all around the world, men and women, unfortunately, joined ISIS, and some of the first cases of prosecuting ISIS were in Germany, and it was a huge success. A lot of survivors after that came forward. And even though that survivor was able to go to the court throughout the process, but never showed her face until today, because she wanted to be able to, after that, rebuild her life. And she has a son, and I talked to her, I know her, and she never shared her face publicly, but she went to every hearing, and she was able. And she told me one thing. She said, before what ISIS did to her, she never heard of the courtroom, like people can be lawyers or anything. She never went to school. She never left her farm, and yet she was taken into captivity. Her daughter was killed, her sons were taken, her husband, and she was able, after she was displaced, to come and share her story and two ISIS members were publicly held accountable in Germany. Of course, there are very few cases, and it's a long road to justice. It's slow and it's very painful. But when you see a survivor there at the court and see perpetrators being held accountable, it just brings hope to all survivors. And that is so important because they prioritize that over financial reparations or going back or moving outside. They prioritize accountability over all the other things.
Yeah, I would just say about the accountability, I couldn't agree with you more, Nadia. And, you know, it's not only is it a long road that Nadia said, sometimes there's a couple of steps backwards, and this is what we have to be careful about. So I thought when I worked on my prosecution case in the Rwanda tribunal, when I left, that the three accused who were responsible for inciting sexual violence and dehumanizing people through being the owner of a newspaper and a radio station, they were broadcasting genocide. They facilitated all the stigma against the Tutsi population, making people who were neighbors and who got along one day able to take a machete and kill their next door neighbor because they had been sensitized, right? From that hate speech, hate these people, be afraid of these people. If you don't kill them, they're going to kill you one day, right? And so when they were convicted, these leaders of the media, all the survivors couldn't believe it, even though they testified and bought into the UN's trial and did their best, they never believed it. And they were so happy afterwards that they got justice, right? And that was December 3rd of 2003. And then 3 years ago, I think it was during COVID, I got a call from The Guardian that one of the accused, who we got a life sentence for, Hassan Ngezi, was likely to be released by the Rwandan tribunal because there's a residual mechanism looking at issues of parole or pardoning people for humanitarian reasons if they're very sick or aged. And so I was very surprised because I knew Hassan Ngezi was neither sick. He never took accountability for his case, for what he did, never made reparations, was behaving very badly in jail as well. And even if he behaved well, I mean, he was responsible for 1 million Tutsis being killed because his magazine incited it more than any one bullet could. And he was about to be let go. And this judge had just let the other person in our trial go off on humanitarian basis because he was old. So look at that. That what was in 2003, the judge's will, that 3 people should be having life sentences. Another judge, 20 years later, it's no longer a big deal. They're old. It was civil war. These things happen. This is the consequence of war. We have to bring these people back into society. So this is a problem to minimizing what happened generations later. And Nadia was appointed, Nadia was awarded, and rightfully so, to be a Nobel laureate just a few years ago. And what's really important to me is that as we move farther and farther away from what happened to the Yazidi population years ago, that we don't forget that those people who came to Nadia and said, this is horrible, I want to do something about it, stay with her cause and don't move on to the next popular cause of the day. I mean, this is what my concern is, that we are very fickle in our help. And that's why the Murad principles: don't get involved unless you're really going to help out. And don't ask survivors to educate you. There's so much material out there. That's your burden to do, not theirs. Do your research, figure out how you can help, and don't go to a survivor, how can I help? Come up with some ideas beforehand where you can be useful, right? So do your homework is what I say. And I know all of you who are such wonderful students who are so well informed and who chose to take this class. I don't have to say that to, but you can say that to your friends and families who are, yes.
I think that's a great way to, and we'll have our student who's going to close come up now, but I do get a moment, so I get to say that Nadia, first of all, Simone, you are incredible. You are welcome back anytime at American University. Thank you for all your we want you back to further the conversation. Nadia, it's just been a personal privilege to get to know you, to have, it's been an honor to have you do this program. But I have to say, I've learned so much personally. I hate to see this part end, but like I said, we're not, you're not gone from us. But I think you've helped me learn a lot too about, people are not just what's happened to them. They are who they are, and that, there's so many different facets to them. I've learned so much about you and, just everything that motivates you and the incredible stories. And thank you for your incredible courage in what you do. So I wanted to thank you both, and we'll let our student close it out today.
Thank you for attending today's event. We at Science say convene, communicate, and collaborate. So when you leave this place, please, we can carry the lessons from this panel into our work and our personal lives. The final seminar for the spring 2025 is April 17th in MGC room 307 for Sylvia Burwell's career conversation. We want to give a big thank you to our co-sponsors for this event, the AU Sociology Department and the DC Sociological Society. We are grateful for our moderator, Amy, who guided this critical conversation. And I also want to say thank you to Simone Mona Sabian for being here with us today. Finally, we want to give a big thank you to Nadia Murad for sharing her story and listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I was thinking that that was good. I would want to. You sharing the story about what she said. And I put us in the room with so special.
Also, my like other than sitting in the back, he's like,